Okay, everyone, please welcome David Magee. Welcome back, David. I think this is your third or fourth time.
Third time, I think, at least, yes. Yeah. So thank you very much. That was very nice.
Well, so you're no stranger to adaptations. So was there anything challenging adapting this story for an American audience?
Well, this was based on a Swedish novel that some of you may have read by Fredrik Backman. A beautiful story, and then a Swedish film that was very popular a few years back. And there are obviously cultural differences between the United States and Sweden, so those had to be solved. Socialized medicine plays a role in the fact that the neighbor has to be moved out of his house, and so we had to change all of that, obviously. And there are various things about retirement and which aspects of the novel we wanted to include in the story and we left out had a great deal to do with that. But really, that's all a big math problem that you have to solve. You know, those are the technical problems. What was most important to us is that all of us loved Otto and his relationship with Parvena in the Swedish story was an Iranian woman, and obviously we translated that over to Marisol. I felt from the very beginning like I knew Otto, like he was someone I knew from my own family, and everyone who was on set would come up to me and say, I know an Otto in my life. And that was the most important part to me. And so while there are differences culturally, those folks who have had trouble in their lives, who have grown up believing that you're not supposed to share your problems and reach out to others when you're suffering, and say everything's okay no matter what, also end up being those people who get grumpy very easily. And I knew that from my own life, from my own father when he was sick for several years, and so I felt like I knew this character. And so that was not a hard translation for me either in that sense, I don't think.
Okay. Well, as you just touched on, I was going to ask the next question. Like, how did you get into the mind of Otto?
I grew up in Flint, Michigan, in the Midwest, and Flint was a thriving town when I was young, and it wasn't much after that. And so I immediately saw this as a story about that kind of a culture and that kind of an upbringing. And I saw Otto, who is not my father, by the way. I mean, they're very different people, but, my family grew up in a town that, held all sorts of promise in the beginning, and then things started falling apart, and, the future didn't hold as much promise as the past did, and there's a lot of disillusionment. And so that was what I identified with very much so. And when we were looking for locations, we talked about Michigan, we talked about Ohio. We ended up in Pittsburgh, in the steel industry, and Otto works for a steel manufacturer, or steel fabricating company. And we just wanted that sense that while the past was not, the world had not completely fallen apart, times were moving on, things were changing, and people of a certain generation were being left behind. And so, what happens to those people when they wake up one day and they have nothing to do with their lives and the people they love have passed on? That was what was most important to me in all of that.
Otto, I find, is very interesting. In another movie, I felt like he could have been the outcast, but you never treated him. No one in the town seemed to treat him as an outcast. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it exactly that way, but that's true. I mean, this is a story about a man that if you don't know what he's going through, you could easily think is that irritating, eccentric neighbor who just, you have no patience with. Now, obviously, in this setting, several of the people have lived with him for years and have known him for years, and so they understand what he's been through, and they forgive him his idiosyncrasies and his difficulties. What is so beautiful about this story for me is this is about Marisol and Tommy coming in And Marisol, who in my private narrative had a father very much like Otto, sees immediately the kind of guy he is and has no patience for it. It's like, no, you're not going to just hide from me. You're not going to be that guy. I'm going to stick my foot in your door, and you're going to be nice to me. And I'm going to tell you, you're difficult. Stop being difficult. And I loved that aspect of the story, that someone would just say, no, I'm not just going to decide to give up on you. I'm not going to ignore you. You're my new neighbor. So you're going to have to deal with that. And to me, that's kind of the most beautiful part of this story, is Marisol just kind of insisting on being a part of his life. And I just have to say, and as an aside, that Mariana, who plays her, is above and beyond. I mean, just she's so good in that role. And I know you guys saw it along with me, but oh my God. We couldn't have hoped for a better actress to do that role. And everyone does a fantastic job in this, but she did everything and more that you could have ever wanted for that role.
Marisol, she very easily could have been abrasive or so forth, but how was it balancing, as you said, like foot on the door, but not like, being abrasive?
Well, I think she is an effusive person. It's interesting, there is a slight transition from the Swedish film where Marisol's family was from Iran, and she's a little more stern and she has no patience for Otto. And in our version, it's more, no, I have patience for you forever, but I'm not going to put up with you. So just let's make that distinction clear, And so that was kind of the fine line that I was trying to walk. But then honestly, her performance, I didn't have to do a lot of tweaking to make that work. She kind of came in and just blew us all away. So.
Well, I mean, speaking of no patience, I find Otto an interesting character. To jump back to him is like, maybe I have a little bit of Otto in me. I don't know, but
I think we all do.
But like
probably.
he's not a bad guy, and the things he wants are not wrong. It's just how he goes about it.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, Otto to me is what makes him such a lovable character in the end is he's a fundamentally decent human being. He does care about the right things happening in the world, but he's tired and he has gone through so much and he's lost patience with people. And this is the story I tell I've told a couple of folks, and I'm telling you, about my father, is that he was sick for several years with cancer, and he was always the kind of guy who you would say, how you doing? And he'd go, I'm fine. And you're like, really? And you could tell he was in pain that day. And you'd go, no, I'm fine. But then we would go out to a restaurant, and he'd be grumpy with the waiter in a way where if you were the waiter, you'd be like, what a grumpy dude, come on. And if you're his son, you'd be like, well, this is kind of awkward and a little funny, but at the same time sad, because I know the reason you're behaving like this. And so that, to me, was Otto. His impatience was coming out of disappointment and frustration and sadness, in a sense that the world was going on without him and he had nothing to do, So what was the joy of writing? The joy of writing this for me was introducing you first to a guy who just seemed grumpy for a few minutes, and then you realize that he's not just grumpy, he's in pain and he's sad. And then the next time you see him get grumpy, you see why he's grumpy and you're looking from the other side with him. So that gradually you're seeing more and more, oh, he's been through a lot, and I know exactly why he does not want that clown to take that quarter. It's funny, but it's not. This is serious. It's not just a joke that he's going to take his quarter from him. So that was the joy of writing the character for me, was finding the way to bring you into that so that you were understanding him from that side of things.
And then you get the nicest man in America cast as the grumpiest man.
Yeah.
At what point did that come in? Had you already had a screenplay drafted?
It was Rita Wilson who reached out to me and asked if I wanted to do this. She saw the original Swedish version of the film, and she said to Tom, we got to do this. And Tom went, sure, yeah. And, she's got a pretty good track record of her own with picking out, with Mamma Mia and My Big Fat Greek Wedding. She's done some amazing producing. She saw this. She said, we got to do this. She reached out to me, and And I said, I loved that. I saw the film first at the same time approximately that they did, because the screeners came out for the Academy Awards for foreign film, I don't know, 8 years ago. And I loved the film. And then I read the book, and then she reached out and said, would you be interested? And I said, I'd love to. That'd be great, but who would direct it? Because it's hard to get a film like this made. There's almost no superheroes in this. Or special effects beyond, making sure the cat did what he was supposed to. So I wanted to make sure that we were working with the right team to get this made, and she came back very shortly after that and said, what about Mark Forster, who I did Finding Neverland with 20 years ago? And I said, yeah, of course, if he'd do it. And Mark signed on, and we were on our way. And Mark and I have such a wonderful relationship that we're working on another film coming up now. We kind of rolled right into the next one because everything was a shorthand on this one, and just we worked so easily together that we just said, well, let's do another.
So it was like one of those relationships where no time had passed, you just picked right up?
Yeah, it was literally, and he looks exactly the same. So, yeah, we just rolled right into the next film, and we've had just a wonderful time working together. So,
as you mentioned, Rita Wilson, from what I read, this was like a real passion project for her. Like, she was really excited about this one. Mm-hmm. What was it like specifically working with Rita?
She's wonderful. Not only is she wonderful, she composed that song that's playing on the radio, if you folks didn't know. Mark said to her one day, because she's obviously, for those of you who know, she is a composer, and she does write music and sing. And Mark said to her earlier on, you should write a song for the movie. And then right afterwards, they both separately, like Rita was like, oh, what if it's no good? And Mark went, what if it's no good? And it turned out to be that song, and it's wonderful, and they've done a wonderful job with it.
She sings on it too, right?
Yes, it's I'm not going to remember his name. The guy who she composed it with sings just on the radio in the car during the film, and they sing a duet at the end. But I'm sorry, I can't remember his name off the top. Was that? Thank you, Sebastian.
So there was also Frederick Wickstrom who produced the film, and he produced the Swedish film.
That's
too,
correct.
Right?
He read the original book in Galleys, and he just really liked it. And SF Studios, the Swedish company that he worked for, he brought it to them. And before the book had been published, he said we should just do a film of this. And it's a beautiful film. It's different in many ways from ours, not just because it's Americanized, but because the book itself gives you a lot of world to explore, because it's 200,000 words and a script is only a fraction of that, a tenth of that maybe. But it's a beautiful film in its own right, and it's what got me here. So.
I want to ask about Sonia, his wife. Yes. She has a presence throughout the film, even when not on screen. Mm-hmm. How did you go about, threading her through the entire film?
One of my favorite parts of working on this film was finding a way to integrate the past and the present in the same scenes. And I mentioned the Swedish film, and this is by no means a critique of the Swedish film, but that moment when Otto tries to hang himself for the first time. He tries to hang himself, and then you hear voiceover, and it's a voiceover essentially saying, when I was young, and he goes for like 10, 15 minutes, going back into his backstory and what his father was like and the train. So it was kind of jumping aside, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to find a way to have the past and the present kind of a continuing part of Otto's narrative, and it seemed to me, because I don't know, I think this is most people, like when I'm walking around the house by myself, I might be thinking about a conversation I had 20 years ago and even talking to myself about that person. And then, making my breakfast, and then I remember something else, and that gives me to another memory. And so we wanted to have that free-flowing sense of life, flowing in on him. So we kind of developed a style where he could, when he was in his more reflective moments, he could look at a book, he could look out a window, he could see a train passing or a car and reflect on his wife. And so it was almost like she was, you talk about people who've lost someone close to them, they've been with for years, they talk to them every day. I wanted that feeling like she was always there with him. And working with Mark, he actually took that a step further in that he would then shoot scenes that I had written for Truman, Tom's son, who plays young Otto, and he would shoot them from Tom's perspective and have Tom just say the lines. So when he's sitting in the car, he would start saying, I wanted you to have whatever you wanted to eat, and I'm sorry, I should go, that sort of thing. He'd have Tom doing it in the car so he could cut back and forth in whatever way he wanted to in order to make it have that immediacy.
Now, the suicide attempt scenes, I mean, it's a very serious subject matter, and I feel like they're very carefully handled. I even feel like the pacing of the scenes, it slows down, almost like a reverence for the subject matter. Can you speak to the approach to those?
Absolutely. So the most important line to me, and it might seem like a throwaway line in the film, but the most important line to me was when I watched the Swedish film, that's one line I took straight from it, was at the end when he's in the car and he goes, "This is living." Because to me, this is not a story about someone who wants to kill himself. It's about someone who's trying to find a way to live again. And that was the perspective that I put on all of this. So the reason he starts wanting to try and kill himself is that he's lost his wife, he's grieving, he's mourning, and then one day he wakes up and they say, "We don't need you at work either." And he says, "I don't have anything to do." He literally says, I don't have anything to do. And then every time he tries to kill himself, he says to someone else, "I've got things to do." Because he's actually looking for some way to continue. He's trying to find things that make his life matter. And when he can't find it, he goes into these moments where he thinks he wants to kill himself, but he never gets far enough. He gets pretty close in the car sequence, but for the most part, what he's doing is he's walking up to the edge, and then he's flashing on memories of Sonia where she's saying, "All right, that's enough now." And only at the end do you realize she's saying, "You got to keep living. This is enough of this. I know this is terrible. I know you're hurting. You got to keep living." So I never wanted this to be about a man who wants to die. It's about a man who wants to find reasons to live.
The street they live on. I feel like it's a character in the movie.
Absolutely. You don't have to say anymore. So in the Swedish film, it takes place in what is essentially almost a communal living situation where it's the closest equivalent I could figure out in my head was, well, it's like townhouses, I guess, except, there's a very controlling board that runs it, and all the garages are at the far end of the street, and I don't think there's anything like that in America. I don't think we can find that. So I was trying to find the closest equivalent I could in my mind, and then they went to Pittsburgh and they did a location shoot, and they found that street. And that's it. That's exactly, and all we had to do is put a fence at the end that you had to go in order to come in and out, and it was exactly what I had been just trying to fake my way through in the script before we knew what we were doing. And they went to the guy who had recently bought it, who was a self-made man, an immigrant who had started with one apartment complex, and now he had 30, and he said, "My wife's favorite actor is Tom Hanks. You can have it," And there were tenants who lived in some of those houses. They just had to go out the back door, and he essentially gave them a discount on their rents, and they repainted everything, and they put new roofs on all of that, but otherwise, that was the street. We just couldn't believe our incredible luck in finding that.
All the other characters in the neighbors, I feel like in the beginning, you play with our preconceived notions of that type of character, but they all break out. Can you speak to the ensemble?
Absolutely. I mean, we had a wonderful cast in all of that. Cameron, who played Jimmy, the guy with the eccentric exercise habits. It's one of those shames that you can't go fully into the story of Jimmy, because Jimmy grew up in that neighborhood, and Otto was always there for him, and his father was abusive, and Otto and the neighbor Reuben, in the American version, actually protected him. So he's a fast friend to all of them. And we just didn't have time in our film to create that, short of doing a miniseries. So but that's what Cameron was playing, this kind of sweet man who had struggled, who was trying to make the best of things, and who was devoted to all of the adults in the neighborhood. And Ruben and Anita, both actors, do a tremendous job of that. I think you do get more of their backstory and things. And you know, it's you know, you look at any neighborhood from the outside, or you even look at Otto from the outside, and they're that stereotyped kind of cranky person or kind of silly person, but underneath it, they're really genuinely sweet people who are doing their best to care for each other, and that's what makes it work, I think.
The final confrontation in the script, can you speak to your work on that?
Yes, so Die and America was my invention, because as I said, in Sweden, socialized medicine and socialized housing meant, oh, well, if you're no longer able to take care of yourself in this house, we're going to move you to assisted living, to another unit. And I don't know exactly how the legalities of that work, but apparently they're able to do that. And of course, that's not the case in America. So we created the estranged son who's living, you know, off in Asia, and Die in America was a creation of like a real estate conglomerate that had its fingers in everything. It had, you know, retirement communities, and it had assisted living communities, and it even had, you know, its fingers in some health facilities, so that, you know, while they're not supposed to be sharing information, some information was being shared that was going to help them take over this neighborhood that came here before the larger development. So that was a creation that I came up with in order to kind of simulate what was going on in the Swedish story.
Your approach to the themes. Now, the book was 2014, the film 2016, it's almost a decade. I feel like they're even more timely than ever, just in the last 8+ years.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, can you speak to sort of the themes and how they spoke to you?
Well, so it's interesting because this question has kind of come up in the very few talkbacks we've had so far, because this just came up. I mean, the print's still drying on this. So we could not have predicted 4 years ago COVID or the political climate or anything that has happened. We just fell in love with this story about, you know, this man who was not able to share what he was really feeling inside, and the conflict that he was kind of creating in his life, and that others felt, and the distance that was happening between people. But of course, we started shooting this and working on this during COVID, and we were very much aware that we were living in a time when people were not connecting with each other. We're seeing each other from a distance. We're fighting over, you know, things that made them seem further apart in life than they really were. And for us, this was a story about a man who was losing patience with a world that really wanted to, you know, connect with him. And this was about wanting to connect and finding those connections again. And so that became really important to us, and I think we just got lucky in the worst possible way. You know, we came to the story that kind of answered what we were feeling about life as we were making it.
And it's, I mean, it's connections on all fronts. I mean, you've got inclusivity.
Well, and the inclusivity was part of the Swedish film as well. I mean, the neighbors were Iranian instead of Mexican. The boy was gay, the gay son of an Iranian father, a very strict Iranian father, rather than a trans person who was with a father who was not understanding. We were trying to find our American version of that, something that would be immediately identifiable to an American audience and would connect with it, but it was still the same story. It was not about a man who was ever judgmental about other people on the basis of race or sex or anything like that. It was a man who just had lost patience with the world more than anything. So
you're touching on a lot of heavy subjects and thoughts that a lot of us have faced, but working the comedy into it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The original story is funny and sad. The original movie was funny and sad. And to me, that's the sweet spot of any storytelling, because I don't, honestly, in all the saddest times of my life, there have been funny moments. In all of the, you know, kind of the happiest times of my life. There have been sad moments. You know, there is that balance in life, and I've certainly written films that are much darker, and I've written films that are lighter. But the kind of the sweet spot of what life is like is that you go to a funeral and then something happens that allows you to release the tension and the sadness of that. And to me, when you are able to laugh in the middle of sadness, it opens your heart a little more to feel more honestly about what you're feeling. And so I was not trying to go from gag to sadness to sadness. You know, I was trying to, but allow those things to coexist in a way that you'd be on a journey that would open you up more and more to these characters, that you'd see the humanity of them. And I think that's, you know, I think that's a more effective way to take you on a journey like this, rather than take you on an unremittingly dark turn after dark turn after dark turn, where you find yourself kind of folding your arms while you're watching a film.
Well, no, I think you did amazing with balancing all of these tones and so forth. And last question, Chevy or Ford?
Sorry?
Chevy or Ford?
Oh, me?
I'll have to put you on the
No,
spot.
I don't have any opinion on that, although I will say that when I grew up in Flint, Michigan, my father always drove a Buick because you just did, especially in the 1970s, you know. So that I identified with almost immediately. That was like, yep, I remember that. And in the original, it was Saab versus Audi. So.
Well, you are super busy. You've had multiple films come out this year as well, and I know a lot of upcoming projects. So thank you for joining us,
I'm happy to be
and
here.
we'll see you with your next one. Hopefully.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. I do. Thank you. That's great.